The dust didn't settle here. It was a living thing, a fine red ghost that rose with the sun and swirled in the heat shimmer above the cracked earth, and only at night did it lie down, a blanket over a corpse. Harlan Crow knew its taste, its grit on his teeth, the way it settled in the lines around his eyes, until he felt he was made of it, a man of dust and silence. For 10 years, the silence had been his only true companion, a presence more real than the hawk that circled the burned hills or the dry rustle of lizards in the scrub. The silence was a penance. It was the space he had hollowed out of the world to put himself in, and he tended to it like he tended his meager patch of corn, with a grim, relentless patience. He never spoke, not even to the mule that pulled his plow, its ribs a washboard under a coat of grime. Words were stones, and he had thrown enough of them to build a wall around a town, to sink a dozen good men. He had no more to spare. His hands, which had once known the cold, hard certainty of a pistol grip, now knew the splintered wood of the plow handles, the sharp edges of stones he pulled from the soil, the fragile stems of the beans he coaxed from the unforgiving ground. They were broad, scarred hands, the knuckles thick, the nails permanently rimmed with the dark earth he worked. In the mornings, when the chill of the night still clung to the air, they would ache with a memory that had nothing to do with farming. It was a deeper ache, a phantom pain that echoed the weight of a Schofield revolver and the recoil that had once bucked up his arm, again and again, until the world was nothing but smoke and noise and the smell of blood. He would clench and unclench them, staring at the palms as if the stains might reappear, ghosts rising from the flesh. But there was only dirt. Always, now, there was only dirt. Beneath the loose floorboard under his cot lay the other life. He never looked at it, but he knew it was there with the same deep-body certainty that he knew his own name, the one he never used, the one no one had spoken in his hearing for a decade. The gun was wrapped in oilcloth, heavy and cold and patient. Beside it, a pair of cavalry boots, the leather stiff and cracked, the soles worn thin in a way that spoke of miles ridden hard and fast. He had tried to burn them once, in the first year, but the smell of the scorching leather had brought back the smell of Black Creek, of burning homesteads, and something else, something sickeningly sweet that had choked the air and sent him heaving into the dust. So he had buried them instead, a funeral for a man he was pretending to be dead. But the dead don't always stay buried. Sometimes they sleep under the floorboards, waiting for their name to be called. He had been plowing the south field, the one that gave him the most trouble, the sun a hammer on the back of his neck, when he first saw it, a smudge on the horizon, a slow crawling disturbance in the shimmering curtain of heat. It was not a dust devil. It moved with purpose. It was not a rider on business. No one had business with him. For a long moment, he simply stood, the plow handles slick with sweat in his grip, his heart a slow, heavy drum against his ribs. He had seen men approach like that before, dots growing into threats, and the old instinct tightened the muscles in his shoulders, dropped his hand halfway to his hip where nothing hung. But this was different. The movement was too slow, too labored. It was the crawl of the wounded or the desperate. He watched for the better part of an hour as the smudge resolved itself into a horse and rider. The animal's head hung low, its gait a stumbling, exhausted shuffle. The rider was slumped forward, a small, dark bundle clutched to their chest. A woman. He could see that now. A woman riding a near-dead horse into the heart of his carefully constructed silence. A cold dread, colder than the winter wind that swept down from the hills, washed over him. He did not want this. He wanted the dust and the sun and the ache in his hands, the familiar litany of his penance. He did not want a visitor. Visitors brought the world with them, and the world was full of names. He left the plow where it stood, a wooden skeleton in the field, and walked back to the farmhouse. The single room was dark and cool, a cave dug out of the heat. He went to the water bucket, drank a dipperful, the metal cool against his lips. He could feel her getting closer, a ripple in the stillness he had cultivated. He should have turned her away. He should have fetched his rifle from its pegs on the wall and stood on the porch, a clear and silent warning. It was what the man he was now was supposed to do. But the sight of the bundle she carried, the way she was hunched over it, protective and broken, stirred something else. A ghost of a memory, not of war, but of something before it, a different kind of life, a different kind of man. He stayed in the shadows of the room, watching through the open doorway as she came on. The horse stopped 20 yards from the porch, its sides heaving, its legs trembling. It would not go another step. The woman did not seem to notice. She slid from the saddle, her legs buckling so that she nearly fell, and then she straightened, her face a mask of grime and exhaustion, and started walking toward him. She held the bundle like it was the last sacred thing in a godless world. He could see it clearly now. A child. A boy, wrapped in a threadbare blanket, his head lolling against her shoulder. She stopped at the foot of the 3 rickety steps that led to his porch. Her eyes were wide and dark in her dust-caked face, and they were fixed on him, a man standing in the shadows of his own home. She looked like she had ridden out of a nightmare, her dress torn, her hair a wild tangle of straw and sweat. But there was no fear in her eyes, only a raw, bottomless desperation that was more terrifying than any threat. She swayed on her feet, and for a moment he thought she would collapse. "He's burning," she said, her voice a dry rasp, the first human voice to break the silence of his homestead in years. It sounded foreign, an intrusion of shattering glass. "He's got the fever. Been 3 days." Harlan said nothing. He remained a silhouette against the dark interior of the house, his face unreadable. He was a stone, a part of the landscape. He had willed it so. Stones do not help. Stones do not get involved. The woman took a half-step forward, a lurch of pure will. They said you knew things, about wounds, about stopping the bleeding." She was looking for a soldier then, a field medic. She had the wrong man, or the right one, depending on what you called bleeding. He had been an expert in starting it. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible shake of his head. A denial. A warning. Go away. Her face crumpled, the hard mask of determination cracking to reveal the terror beneath. "Please," she whispered, and the sound was the scrape of a soul on rock bottom. "He's all I have. My boy. His name is Samuel." She clutched the child tighter, a movement of fierce, animal love. The boy let out a low moan, a fretful sound that seemed to pull at the very air in Harlan's lungs. He remained silent, his jaw set like iron. He could not. He would not. To help her was to let the world in. To let her in was to let the past in, and the past was a flood that would drown them all. The woman seemed to read the refusal in his stillness. A new wave of despair washed over her face, and her shoulders slumped. She looked down at the boy in her arms, her lips moving silently. Then she looked back up at Harlan, and her eyes held a different light. Not pleading now, something else. A strange, haunted recognition. She had ridden 40 miles, she had said. She must have heard the stories, the whispers, the name. He kept calling a name, she said, her voice dropping lower, becoming thick with a kind of awe and fear. "In the fever. Over and over. I didn't know it. I'd never heard it. But the old woman in Dusty Fork, she knew it. She told me where to ride." Harlan felt the blood drain from his face. The silence in the room became a ringing, a high, thin sound of a wire pulled too tight. He knew what was coming. He felt it like the phantom kick of the Schofield against his palm. The woman, Clara Finch, though he did not know her name then, took a breath, as if the word itself was heavy, a thing with a terrible weight. She looked from the ghost in the doorway to the fevered child in her arms, a bridge between two impossible things. "He called for Crow," she whispered, and the name, his name, the one he had not heard, the one he had tried to bury, landed in the quiet of the room. But it was the next words that broke him, the next words that shattered the silence of 10 years and pulled the floorboards up from under his feet. "He kept crying," she said, her voice breaking. "He said, 'Papa Crow.'" The world tilted. The dust, the heat, the silence. It all fell away. He was no longer a man of dirt and penance. He was a name a dying boy was crying for. He stepped out of the shadows and into the harsh, unforgiving light and held out his arms for the child. The boy was a furnace in his arms, a terrifying, fragile heat. His skin was dry and flushed, his breathing shallow and fast. Harland carried him inside, the woman following like a shadow, and laid him on the cot, the one with the buried life beneath it. The boy's eyes were closed, the lids a bruised, translucent purple. He muttered something, a thick, fevered string of nonsense, and his small hand, no bigger than a sand dollar, twitched and clenched. Harland looked at that hand, and for a moment he did not see a child. He saw a flash of another hand, small and still, lying in the dust of Black Creek, a single polished brass button clutched in its palm. A button from a soldier's coat. His coat. He shook the memory away, a dog shaking off water. It was a ghost. It was not real. The boy on his cot was real. The heat coming off him was real. The woman's ragged breathing behind him was real. "Water," he said, and his own voice was as raw and unused as the woman's. He gestured to the bucket. She scrambled to get it, her hands clumsy, spilling some on the floor where it was instantly devoured by the dry wood. He tore a strip from a clean shirt, dipped it in the water, and began to bathe the boy's face. The cool cloth on the hot skin made the boy sigh, a sound that was half pain, half relief. He worked with a concentration that shut everything else out. The woman, the past, the name she had spoken. There was only the task. The fever was the enemy. It was a siege, and the boy's body was the fortress, and he, Harland Crow, was the unlikely defender. He sent the woman out to his meager herb garden, a patch of green he kept alive with dogged determination. He told her what to find: yarrow for the fever, willow bark for the pain. She flew to the task, her desperation given a direction, a purpose. While she was gone, he examined the boy. There was no wound, no snake bite, no obvious cause for the fire that was consuming him. It was an illness of the blood, a poison from within, the kind he couldn't just cut out. The woman, Clara, came back with the herbs clutched in her hand, her eyes fixed on him, watching his every move. He crushed the plants, steeped them in hot water, creating a bitter, dark tea. The smell filled the small room, sharp and medicinal. Getting the boy to drink was a battle. He had to pry the child's clenched teeth apart, pour the liquid in a few drops at a time, stroking his throat to make him swallow. The boy coughed and sputtered, his small body fighting the intrusion. During the struggle, his eyes fluttered open. They were glassy, unfocused, staring up at Harland with no recognition. "Papa?" he whispered, the word a feather on the air, and then his eyes rolled back, and he was gone again, lost in the fever's gray country. Harland froze, his hands stilled on the boy's chest. The word echoed in the silence. It was not the name the woman had said. It was something else, something more dangerous. He looked over at her. She stood by the hearth, her face a mess of hope and fear. She had heard it too. She said nothing, just wrapped her arms around herself, watching him. There was a question in her eyes, a question he had no answer for. He was not a papa. He was the butcher of Black Creek. He was the man who had left a child's hand clutching a button in the dust. Night fell. The heat of the day bled out of the land, replaced by a desert chill. Harland lit a single lantern, the light pushing the shadows into the corners of the room, making them dance. He sat on a three-legged stool beside the cot, bathing the boy, forcing the bitter tea down his throat, hour after hour. Clara sat in the single wooden chair on the other side of the room, a silent, unmoving vigil. The silence between them was different now. It was not the empty silence of Harlan's solitude. It was a silence filled with unspoken things, the name of a battle, the name of a father, the name of a man who was both and neither. In the deepest hours of the night, when the world seemed to hold its breath, the boy's fever spiked. His body went rigid, his back arching off the cot, a terrible guttural cry tearing from his throat. His limbs thrashed, and Harlan had to hold him down, his large, scarred hands gentle but firm on the small, flailing body. It was like holding a wild bird. The boy's strength was unnatural, a product of the fever's madness. Clara cried out, a sharp, terrified sound, and rushed to the bedside. "What's happening?" she gasped, her hands fluttering uselessly around her son. "The fever's breaking," Harlan said, his voice a low growl of concentration. "Or it's taking him. Hold his legs." She did as she was told, her own body trembling. Together they held the child as the storm raged inside him. He was burning through the last of his reserves, a candle flame guttering in a high wind. Harlan could feel the life in him, a frantic thrumming thing, and he could feel it slipping. He pressed the cool cloth to the boy's forehead, his neck, his wrists, trying to anchor him to the world. He found himself whispering to him, the words coming from a place he thought had long since turned to ash. "Easy, son. Easy now. Just hold on. Just a little longer." The seizure passed. The boy went limp, his body suddenly boneless, terrifyingly still. A sheen of sweat broke out on his skin, drenching the blanket, his hair, the cot. Harlan put his ear to the boy's chest. The heart was still beating. A flutter, weak and erratic, but it was there. The breathing was shallow, but it was there. The fever had broken. He was still alive. Harlan slumped back on his stool, the strength going out of him. He was covered in the boy's sweat, his own shirt soaked through. He felt as if he had been the one fighting the fever, wrestling it to the ground. He looked at his hands. They were trembling, not with the memory ache of the gun, but with simple, profound exhaustion. Clara was weeping, silent tears tracking clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. She touched her son's face, his hair, with a reverence that was painful to watch. "He's cool," she whispered. "Oh, God, he's cool." Harlan nodded, unable to speak. He got up, his joints protesting, and went to the hearth. He added a log to the embers, coaxing a small flame to life. The room needed warmth now, a gentle, steady warmth to ward off the chill that follows a fever. He made more of the willow bark tea, a weaker brew this time. When he turned back, Clara was looking at him, her eyes shining in the firelight. "I have no money," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "I have nothing to pay you with." He shook his head. He hadn't thought of payment. The idea was absurd. What was the currency for a thing like this? What was the price for a ghost's penance? "Why?" she asked, the single word holding a universe of questions. "Why did you help? Why do you live like this? Why did a dying boy call your name?" He had no answer for her. The truth was a landscape of ash and bone, a place he could never ask her to walk. So he just shrugged, a gesture of finality, and went back to the boy's side. He sat there for the rest of the night, watching the child's chest rise and fall, a fragile rhythm that was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. He did not think of Black Creek. He did not think of the gun under the floor. He only thought of the rise and fall of a child's breath. For 2 more days, the boy, Samuel, slept. It was a deep, healing sleep, broken only by moments of wakefulness where Harlan or Clara would spoon broth and tea into his mouth. He was weak, his body emaciated by the ordeal, but he was alive. The life had returned to his face, a pale but steady flame. During those 2 days, a strange domesticity settled over the grim farmhouse. Clara cooked, her movements becoming less frantic, more measured. She cleaned, sweeping the dust from the floor, washing the few dishes with a quiet efficiency. She mended Harlan's torn shirt, her needle moving with a practiced rhythm. She was bringing the house back to life, just as her son was coming back to life. Harlan found himself watching her. He watched the way the light from the window caught the stray hairs at the nape of her neck. He watched her hands, worn but capable, as she kneaded dough for bread. He had not been this close to another person, to a woman, in 10 years. Her presence was a warmth that seeped into the cold corners of his existence. It was a dangerous warmth. It felt like hope, and hope was a thing he had no right to. He spent his time outside, fixing the fence on the corral, splitting wood, tending to the animals. He needed the physical labor, the familiar ache in his muscles. It was a way to keep his thoughts from straying into treacherous territory. But even outside, the house felt different. It was no longer just a shell, a place to hide. It had a heart now, a sleeping boy and a waiting mother. On the 3rd morning, he was coming in from the well, a bucket of fresh water in each hand, when he heard it. A voice, not the woman's, a child's voice, thin but clear. "Mama?" He stopped in the doorway, his heart clenching. Clara was at the boy's side in an instant, her face radiant. "I'm here, Sammy. I'm right here." Samuel's eyes were open, and they were clear. The fever glass was gone. He looked at his mother, a small smile touching his lips. Then his gaze drifted past her, across the small room, and settled on Harlan, standing in the doorway, a hulking silhouette against the morning sun. The boy's brow furrowed in a faint, childish confusion. He looked at the big, silent man, at his scarred hands, his grim face, the sadness that seemed to hang about him like a shroud. He looked, and he did not see a monster. He did not see a butcher. He saw the man who had sat with him in the dark. He saw the hands that had cooled his brow. He saw the face that had been there when he woke up. He smiled, a weak but genuine smile. "Papa," he said, the word soft, a statement of fact. He thought he was home. He thought the man in the doorway was his father, the one he had lost so long ago. He barely remembered his face. Clara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She looked at Harlan, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and something he couldn't name. Pity? Fear? Understanding? Harlan stood frozen, the water buckets pulling at his arms. The sun was at his back, but he felt a profound and terrible chill. The boy had said the word again, not in the fever's delirium, but in the clear light of day. It was a mistake, a child's confusion. But it struck Harlan with the force of a physical blow. He had been called many names in his life: son, trooper, sergeant, hero for a short and bloody time. And then the other names, the ones that stuck: the butcher, the devil of Black Creek, murderer, ghost. He had accepted them, had built his life, his penance, around their weight. But no one, in all his 40 years, had ever called him Papa. He saw a future flash before his eyes, a phantom life, a boy calling his name across a field, a woman's hand in his, a home that was not a hiding place, a life that was not a penance. It was a beautiful, impossible mirage, and it terrified him more than any memory of battle, because to reach for it would be the ultimate lie. A man like him did not get a life like that. His hands were stained, not with dirt, but with blood that would never wash away. The boy was wrong. The name was wrong. He turned without a word, setting the buckets down on the porch with a thud that sloshed water onto the dry boards. He walked away from the house, away from the woman's shocked face and the boy's innocent gaze. He walked out to the field where his plow still stood, a lonely sentinel. He gripped the handles, the wood familiar and real in his hands. He leaned his weight into it, urging the mule forward, and began to cut a new furrow in the unblinking, unforgiving earth. He worked until the sun was high and hot, until his muscles screamed and sweat blinded him. He worked until there was nothing in his head but the strain, the dust, the rhythm of the labor. He was trying to bury the word under a mountain of work. He was trying to become a man of dirt and silence again, but he could not. The word was there, a seed planted in the barren soil of his soul. Papa. He did not go back to the house for the midday meal. He couldn't face them. He couldn't face the hope he might see in the woman's eyes, or the confusion in the boy's. He stayed in the fields, a solitary figure under the vast empty sky. But as the afternoon wore on, a new feeling began to creep in, a feeling he hadn't known for a decade: worry. The boy was still weak. He needed care. The woman was alone. What if the fever returned? What if he was needed? The thought was a hook in his gut, pulling him back. The silence he had once craved now felt like a dereliction of duty. It was a strange and bitter irony. The man who had run from all human connection was now tied by an invisible thread to a woman and a child he had known for less than a week. When the sun began to dip toward the burned hills, casting long, skeletal shadows across the land, he finally turned back. He walked slowly, his boots kicking up puffs of red dust. The farmhouse looked different now, smoke curling from its chimney, a warm, yellow light glowing in the window. It looked like a home. The sight of it made his chest ache. He stopped on the porch, hesitating. He could hear their voices inside, the woman's low murmur, the boy's thin, reedy responses. It was a sound of life, of peace. He had no place in it. He was a creature of the shadows, a ghost who had lingered too long in the light. He should leave. He should pack his few belongings, take his mule and disappear. Find another patch of forgotten land, another silence to crawl into. It was the right thing to do, the honorable thing. He put his hand on the rough-hewn doorframe, his mind made up. He would go inside, tell her they needed to leave in the morning, that he couldn't help them anymore. He would give them what food he had, point them toward the next town, and then he would vanish. It was a clean break, a necessary amputation. He pushed the door open. Clara was sitting on the edge of the cot, feeding Samuel a bowl of thin soup. The boy was propped up on pillows, looking small and fragile, but his eyes were bright. They both looked up as he entered. The woman's face was guarded, her expression unreadable. The boy smiled, a wide, trusting, innocent smile that knew nothing of Black Creek, of butchers, of men who deserved to be alone. "You're back," Samuel said, his voice filled with a simple, uncomplicated relief. Harlan stood there, caught in the amber light of the lantern, and the lie he had prepared died on his lips. He could not send them away. To send them away now would be a different kind of cruelty, a different kind of murder. It would be killing the fragile, hopeful thing that had taken root in his house, in his life. He looked at the boy, at his trusting face, and he knew he was trapped. Not by the past, not by the name he had earned in blood, but by the one he had been given by a fevered child. He gave a slow, tired nod. He walked over to the hearth, his movements stiff, and began to stir the embers, his back to them. He could feel their eyes on him. He could feel the weight of their presence, the impossible hope they had brought into his exile. He did not know what would happen tomorrow. He did not know how a man like him could live with a woman and a child. He only knew that he could not, would not, be the one to cast them out. The silence was broken. The penance had changed. He was no longer just a ghost. He was Harlan Crow. And a little boy, for reasons God and the fever only knew, thought he was his papa. In the days that followed, a fragile routine took hold, a rhythm as delicate as a bird's heartbeat. Harlan would rise before dawn, the habit of a soldier and a farmer ingrained deep in his bones. He would move about the small cabin with a practiced quiet, stoking the fire, fetching the water, his large frame surprisingly graceful in the cramped space. He avoided looking at the cot where the boy slept, a small mound under the blankets, but he was always aware of him, of the soft sound of his breathing that had replaced the oppressive silence. Clara would rise with the first light, her movements as quiet as his. They would move around each other in the small space, a silent, awkward dance. They rarely spoke, but a language of gestures began to form between them. A nod toward the woodpile, a hand offered to take a heavy bucket, a shared glance at the sleeping child. Samuel grew stronger each day. The color returned to his cheeks, the light to his eyes. He was a quiet boy, made so by illness and the hardships of a life Harland could only guess at. He would watch Harland with a solemn curiosity, his gaze following him as he mended a harness or sharpened a blade. He still called him Papa. The word was a constant, low-level shock to Harland's system, a spark on a raw nerve. He never acknowledged it, never corrected it. He would simply tense, his jaw tightening for a moment, before he continued with his task. He told himself it was a child's fancy, a mistake that would fade as the boy's memory of his real father returned, or as he came to understand that Harland was just a stranger, a grim man who had offered them shelter. Clara, too, never corrected her son. When Samuel would ask, "Is Papa going to the fields?" she would answer, "He is, Sammy. He has work to do." She used the word as a bridge, a way to navigate the impossible space between them. Harland knew she was watching him, trying to understand the man behind the fearsome name she had heard whispered in a dusty town. He would feel her gaze on his back as he worked, a silent, constant questioning. He offered her nothing. His past was a locked room, and he kept the key swallowed deep inside him. One afternoon, he was carving a piece of driftwood he'd found by the creek bed. His knife, honed to a razor's edge, moved with slow precision, peeling away layers of sun-bleached wood. Samuel sat on the porch steps watching, his small hands clasped around his knees. "What are you making?" the boy asked, his voice clear in the still air. Harland didn't look up. "Nothing," he grunted. It was a habit, this carving, a way to keep his hands busy, to whittle away the restless energy that sometimes threatened to consume him. "It looks like a horse," Samuel said, tilting his head. Harland's hands stilled. He looked down at the piece of wood. A head was emerging, a neck, the suggestion of a mane. He hadn't even realized. It was just a shape his hands remembered. He grunted again, a non-committal sound, and resumed carving, his strokes more deliberate now. He worked for another hour, the silence broken only by the scrape of the knife and the buzz of a lazy fly. When he was done, he held it up. It was a crude thing, a horse with 2 thick legs and a blocky head, but it was unmistakably a horse. He sanded it smooth with a piece of sandstone, rubbing away the sharp edges until the wood felt warm and alive in his palm. He held it out to the boy. Samuel's eyes went wide. He looked from the wooden horse to Harland's face and back again. He reached out a hesitant hand, his fingers brushing against Harland's calloused ones as he took the toy. It was the first time they had touched since the fever. The contact was brief, fleeting, but it sent a jolt through Harland. Samuel clutched the horse to his chest. "For me," he whispered. Harland nodded, already turning away, uncomfortable with the raw gratitude in the boy's face. He felt exposed, as if this small act of creation had revealed something he wanted to keep hidden. He was a destroyer, a butcher. He did not make things. He broke them. That night, he lay on his bedroll on the floor, the cot given over to the boy. He could hear Samuel's soft breathing, the rustle of the blanket as he turned in his sleep. He heard him murmur a word. "Papa." The word was not followed by crow. It was just that. A name given in sleep, in a dream. Harlan closed his eyes, the sound echoing in the darkness. The gun under the floorboards felt heavier than usual. A week passed, then 2. The corn grew taller, the beans began to flower. The world went on, oblivious to the strange, fragile life being lived in the forgotten farmhouse. Clara had restored a sense of order, of home to the place. There were curtains on the window made from a patched-up dress. The floor was swept clean. The smell of baking bread often filled the air. She worked from sunup to sundown, her energy tireless. She was earning their keep, proving their worth. Harlan knew he should tell her to stop, that she owed him nothing, but he didn't. He didn't know how to have that conversation. He didn't know how to have any conversation, so he watched, and he worked, and he kept his silence. One evening, a storm rolled in. The sky turned a bruised purple gray, and the wind rose, howling through the burned hills like a chorus of grieving ghosts. Rain came down in sheets, hammering on the roof, turning the dust to mud. It was the first real storm of the season. Harlan secured the animals, checked the roof, and then came inside, shaking the water from his coat. The lantern cast a warm, isolated glow in the room. Clara was humming a tune, a sad, simple melody, as she stitched a patch onto Samuel's trousers. The boy was asleep on the cot, the wooden horse clutched in his hand. The storm outside was a raging beast, but inside there was a pocket of impossible peace. Harlan sat by the fire, cleaning his rifle, the familiar, methodical task a comfort. "He had a horse like that," Clara said suddenly, her voice quiet, almost lost in the sound of the wind and rain. Harlan looked up. She was staring at the sleeping boy, a soft, sad smile on her face. "His father carved it for him," she continued, her gaze distant. "Looked almost the same. He lost it when we had to leave." Harlan said nothing, his hands stilled on the rifle. This was the first time she had mentioned her husband. It was a door opening, just a crack. He didn't know if he should push it or slam it shut. "He was a good man," she said, as if to herself. "A farmer, not a soldier. He didn't know how to fight. When the trouble came, he didn't know what to do." Her voice hitched, and she took a shaky breath. "The fever took him. Last winter. It was fast." Harlan looked down at the rifle in his hands. A tool for fighting. A tool for men who knew what to do when trouble came. He had known what to do, and it had cost him everything. He felt a sudden, sharp pang of something that felt like envy for Clara's dead husband. A farmer who didn't know how to fight. A man who had died in a bed, not in the mud. A man who had earned the name Papa. "I'm sorry," Harlan said, the words feeling clumsy and inadequate in his mouth. She looked over at him, her eyes glistening in the lamplight. "You have nothing to be sorry for. You saved my son." The words hung in the air between them. "You saved my son." It was a simple statement of fact, but coming from her in the intimacy of the storm-bound cabin, it felt like an absolution he hadn't asked for and didn't deserve. He wanted to tell her the truth. He wanted to say, "I am not the man you think I am. I have taken sons from mothers. I have left children alone in the world. The life I saved is a debt against a ledger so stained with blood it can never be balanced." But he couldn't. The words were a poison he had to keep corked. To speak them would be to destroy this fragile peace, to shatter the illusion her son had created. It would be to bring the butcher of Black Creek into this room, and he would not do that. He would not let that man touch them. So he just nodded, a curt, sharp movement of his head, and went back to cleaning his rifle. The storm raged on, but the tension inside the cabin had shifted. A piece of the past had been shared, a piece of the truth, and in its place, a new, more complicated silence grew. It was a silence no longer born of penance, but of protection. He was not just hiding himself from the world anymore. He was hiding the world from them. The next day, the storm had passed, leaving the air clean and cool. The world smelled of wet earth and sage. Harland was repairing a section of fence near the creek bed when he saw Samuel making his way toward him, picking his way carefully over the damp ground. The boy was holding something in his hand. He stopped a few feet away from Harland, his expression serious. "Mama said this was yours," he said, holding out his hand. Lying in his small palm was a brass button. It was tarnished with age, but Harland could still make out the eagle insignia. A cavalry button. He stared at it, the blood roaring in his ears. He hadn't seen it in 10 years. He thought it was gone forever, lost in the dust of that terrible place. "Where did you get this?" Harland's voice was a harsh whisper. "It was in my pocket," Samuel said, his voice small. "The old one. Mama was mending it. She found it in the lining." Harland's mind reeled. The boy, the fever. He had been clutching something. He had thought it was a memory, a ghost. But it was real. The boy had been carrying it. This boy. Samuel. How? How in God's name? He looked at the boy's face, at his wide, innocent eyes, and then he knew. It was not a coincidence. It was not a mistake. This boy, this child who had called his name in a fever, was connected to him, connected to Black Creek. "Your mother," Harland began, his voice strained. "What was her name? Before Finch?" "I don't know," Samuel said, looking confused. "Just Mama." Harland took the button from the boy's hand. It was warm from his skin. He closed his own hand around it, the metal pressing into his palm. A symbol, a key, a piece of the past he had tried to outrun, delivered to him by the child he had saved. He looked from the button to the boy, and a terrible, chilling understanding began to dawn in the deepest corners of his soul. The fever hadn't been random. The whispered name hadn't been a coincidence. The world was smaller and more cruel than he had ever imagined. He was not just hiding from the past. The past had come looking for him. It had ridden 40 miles with a fevered boy in its arms, and it was standing right in front of him, asking for its papa. He didn't weep when the boy spoke, just buried the pistol deeper under the porch.